Hello, everyone. This video is about another McCavitt chapter. McCavitt uses the history of sushi to explain another um, example of how Americans view foreign products. And just like how we studied the history of Honda, we noticed that from all these foreign imports and eventually transplants of sort of semi-foreign, semi-domestic products, we actually know how Americans view imports and possibly people who came to America with the imports as well. So what about sushi? Sushi was introduced to America in 1981. So the first time that it appeared as a publicly sold food item as opposed to a private household item was in Harvard Club. Harvard Club at the time was an upper class northeastern scholarly place. It was frequented by intellectuals, artists, privileged clientele, and it's a formal, stuffy, and sort of detached social social place in the New York institution, in the New York cultural circle. So we can then kind of imagine, it is not a food item for everyone. It was preserved for a certain type of people, right? So what was the cultural context in 1981? So we know that, in the late 70s and early 80s, that's the time when Americans realized that a recession is coming, the economy was bad, etc., etc. So previously, they would expect to see advertisements in Times Square of Camel, Planters, Peanuts, Maxwell House food products, but the signs were replaced by Japanese products such as Panasonic, Sony, and JVC Electronics, Seiko and Casio watches, Midori liqueur, Canon cameras, Fujifilm, etc., etc. So you can imagine there's this, whole culture shock for American consumers. And then in 1945 to 1980s, we actually know that, there's this whole aid and collaboration offered by Americans to Japan because we offered Japan a post-war economic and military protection. We helped them to industrialize. So eventually we saw some trade deficits. So we were not selling as much to Japan as they were selling things to us. So, it's very similar to the rhetoric about China these days, except that obviously that, the situation with Japan and China are historically completely different. However, the kind of like xenophobia, the kind of expectation of having an Asian country with nameless sweatshop Asian factory workers making things for the West, the expectation was very similar. So by the 1980s, then, we already have some industrial imports as well as cultural imports. Since the 50s and 60s, for instance, teriyaki and tempura were imported to America, but it is more like a kind of imperial food import because we were sort of the post-war imperial power over Japan. So we sort of picked and chose those that were similar to our regular diets. And in this case, they ended up being teriyaki and tempura because teriyaki is grilled, right? And tempura is fried, right? So they are more like American food. So they were imported, but they were not considered exactly real Japanese food in sort of like the mind of stereotypes for American consumers. So when sushi was first introduced, sushi was imagined as sort of the authentic, the real Japanese food. In 1981, some astute observers would, for instance, know that the trade deficit calculations and war metaphors, xenophobia, or anti-Japanese racism, all these were just, negative phenomenon in the 80s. But then there are also a lot of nationalistic sentiments um, that were in the public sphere in America. So, because of this threat, right, of trade deficits and also this replacement of Japanese bike, Japanese industrial products, right, of American industrial products. So, um, the kind of anti-Japanese sentiments, the kind of xenophobia appeared. So, war metaphors from World War II were recycled strangely in the 80s. So you can see, for instance, that, Japanese people were imagined as insects, as animals, as unintelligent, as aesthetically not pleasing, as caricatures, etc., etc. So these are war metaphors that originally appeared in the 1940s, and then the kind of like anti-Japanese sentiments, saying Japanese people as deceptive, as leaky, all these racist tropes started emerging in mainstream American society again. Um, we know that a few years before, in 1976, the economic uncertainty started happening, and there's this anger with the socio-political situations in America. People were generally anxious, worried about losing the jobs, worried about their futures, etc., etc. So at the time, American society already had a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in their mind. So, for instance, in the 1975 film Network, we can see how the American characters were sort of losing it.
Cass, where's your lunch?
You're wearing it.
You're nauseating.
What's that?
Sushi.
Sushi?
Rice, raw fish, and seaweed.
You won't accept a guy's tongue in your mouth and you're gonna eat that?
Can I eat?
I don't know. Give it a try. What's your problem? What are we having? Just your standard regular lunch, I guess. Milk? Soup. That's apple juice. I can read. PB&J with the crusts cut off. Well, Brian, this is a very nutritious lunch. All the food groups are represented. Did your mom marry Mr. Rogers? No, Mr. Johnson. Huh.
Okay, so it is in network that we can see how Americans were anxious and uncertain about their future at the time, right? And this happens over and over when the economy is bad, then minorities would be imagined as the culprits. They would be imagined as the reasons of the misfortune of Americans and or even Westerners in general. And of course, this deals with a lot of racism, stereotyping, Orientalism, etc., etc. And we see this happening over and over. For instance, in Nazi Germany, the jazz musicians would be imagined as animalistic, as Jewish, as culturally inferior, as these bad influence in German society. And what did they do? They just played music. And then in the 90s, for instance, we have another film very similar to Network, I would say, in a sense. It's also about a sort of middle class white man who has lost his job, and he is our regular everyday middle class salary man, and he is mad and he has some encounter with Korean and Hispanic immigrants in LA area, and then after that he just cannot take it anymore and he decides to shoot everyone. So there's this. So what it means is that it is whenever the economy is bad, whenever there's uncertainty in American society, that minorities would be targeted. So, for instance, when sushi was first introduced in the mid 80s, um, so it's just a few years, right? It was introduced in 1981 the first time. So by the mid 80s, it became a little bit more popular. So an award-winning columnist would describe it this way: selling sushi as the warning bell for readers, decline of the US, deterioration of traditional values, rejection of heritage, cultural decadence. So you can imagine that, it is always this kind of hurt feelings, this kind of uncertainty, this kind of xenophobia that, triggers this type of, um, anti-foreign, anti-import sentiments. So sushi was imagined as this non-Western and also uncultural type of food product. And then there's also a gender undertone in sushi. So sushi is always imagined as an effeminate food product. It hurts American masculinity as it imagined. So, for instance, the columnist would advise his readers to not offer sushi to boys after their football game or baseball game because he apparently thought that sushi can feminize American boys. Although, at the time, parents, especially wealthy American parents, would sometimes follow the trend and offer their young children sushi and Perrier sparkling water, all these fancy import foods, right? So if we look closely at this comic strip, we also see that um, this is Reagan. So Reagan is saying a gun in every holster, a pregnant woman in every kitchen, make America a man again. So, there's also, this idea that, the conservative side would imagine sushi as this, feminine and culturally inferior imports. And at the same time, they would also remember this legendary baseball player, Bobby Ruth, I believe that's his name. So if you're into baseball, then you would know that he's one of the most important players in American history. And one thing about him is that he really, really loved hot dogs, and his fans would, talk about his stories about eating hot dogs between games. And one time he actually downed 24 hot dogs. Eventually, he ate too many hot dogs and got sick. So, yeah. So we also, for instance, can see, an actual um, stereotyping of sushi eater in the 80s. So, for instance, there's this, class undertone about the behavior of eating sushi in the 80s. John Hill film Breakfast Club, describing high school students eating lunch at school. We'll see that there's this, clear gender and class division among people who eat and don't eat sushi.
What's in there?
Gas. Where's your lunch?
You're wearing it.
You're nauseating.
What's that?
Sushi.
Sushi?
Rice, raw fish, and seaweed.
You won't accept a guy's tongue in your mouth and you're gonna eat that?
Can I eat?
I don't know. Give it a try. What's your problem? What are we having? Just your standard regular lunch, I guess. Milk? Soup. Apple juice. I can read. PB&J with the crusts cut off. Well, Brian, this is a very nutritious lunch. All the food groups are represented. Did your mom marry Mr. Rogers? No, Mr. Johnson. Huh. Here's my...
Right. So we can see, different classes of teenagers, right, eat different foods. And, for women, they were imagined as either this stuck up upper class teenage girl or this weird girl who, eats really, really strange sandwich made by herself, right? But the boys would be these, average American diet eaters, right? They would eat, fruits and chocolate chip cookies and a sandwich and things like that. So that's the imagination. So that means that, sushi eaters were imagined as, from this remote social class, and they might be pretentious. They are not the general public, right? That's the stereotype of sushi eater at the time. So that's why sushi was also imagined as sort of sign of global cosmopolitanism, and sushi eaters were imagined as yuppies, right? The very wealthy and successful, educated, younger professionals. Now, we also know that, during the time that when sushi was first introduced, in the first year in national media, it was imagined as a food of danger. So they thought that raw fish was dangerous, regardless of its preparation. And they thought that the culture of eating raw fish is primitive. Raw fish has parasites. The idea itself is sensually barbaric. It is wild. It is violent. It is exotic. It is scary. So, this goes back to a lot of Orientalist um, thoughts that we talked about, right? That the Orient is imagined as barbaric, as not cultural, as not as irrational, as exotic, right? So this also happens all the time. It is always during times when there are uncertainties and chaos in Western society, that for somewhere things from the Orient or things from non-American world would be imagined as, these scary, disease-carrying things, such as in this we see that it says smallpox and then some other names of diseases. And this is imagined as what's happening in 19th century San Francisco. And it is during the time of this exclusion against Chinese immigrants. So that means, Americans at the time were imagining foreigners bringing diseases. And then here, if you can see this one, it also says disease in his bag, and he's obviously an immigrant coming to America, and then Uncle Tom is, covering his nose. So that means that, again, immigrants are imagined as these, disease carrying, dirty, rough creatures, right? Contaminating this very clean and white world. And then in this one, we also see, this old drawing and portraying, immigrants carrying diseases. Like here, you see the suitcase also says some diseases, germs, and stuff. So it is always imagined as that, America is clean and then the newcomers bring diseases. Now, here, this is a wartime propaganda about Spanish flu, and then again, people were imagined as these scary-looking, right? Possibly non-American people. So again, this sort of a way to scare people. And then here, this one is also about, earlier immigration, right? These are Italian immigrants and just, yeah, mostly Italian immigrants, right? So they were also imagined as, these, right, animalistic creatures, right? They look like, they had a human head, but they had an animal's body, right? And then, Uncle Tom is sort of like, safeguarding the coast, right? Okay, so what about the more contemporary phenomenon? So the more contemporary phenomenon we see, comics portraying the U.S. border and and newcomers are carrying different diseases, right? So again, mind if we tag along, right? So it's always implying that immigrants carry diseases. And then here, this is actually a real case, happened just a few years ago in Texas. So at the time, there was this Ebola outbreak in Africa, and then everyone was freaking out, and a community college actually rejected some students from Africa because although the students were proven not with no contacts with Ebola affected areas, they were still discriminated because they were from Africa. So this means that it really hits home that foreigners are imagined as these things, these dangerous people who brought germs, parasites, diseases to Western society. So sushi was imagined this way. And right now, today, for instance, that we have suddenly a lot of anti-Asian racism going on in America. So this, for instance, is a TikTok video, and this woman is demonstrating how to prepare a type of Vietnamese a raw seafood dish. So she demonstrated the preparation of the octopus, and the octopus, strangely, in this case, um, was that. But then, when she puts the octopus in the sauce is very spicy. It's the sauce made of some condiments and soy sauce and a lot of spicy things. So the octopus then is seen as moving, but actually, really, the sea life's already dead. But because of the sauce that is seen moving, and then people thought that it's actually a type of like eating live animal. So then you see hundreds of comments saying that this is why we have coronavirus, we have swine flu, we have SARS, which is completely irrelevant because it's been practiced in Vietnamese culinary food culture for a long time. And then you would see people blaming Far Easterners as the culprits of the coronavirus outbreak. They would also say that they are bats eating people, although the 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 author of this video is Vietnamese. She's not even Chinese, but we understand that Orientalists cannot simply imagine that there are different types of Asians, right? And then so there's a lot of repeated blame about Asian food culture as the cause of coronavirus. And then here, people would even say all them people dying all over the world, and they still ain't listen. They will listen one day when it's too later. So, that means that they're thinking, people who are dying from the pandemic were sacrificing because of these Asian food practices. And then, they also say you tortured before you ate. So now this is regarding, the imagination of eating live animals, right? Which is actually not happening in this video, but because of the ignorance of Asian food culture, then, right, then the Asians are imagined as cannibals. What else? Octovirus, Corona time. This has happened a lot. Sick people, right? We say that, Easterners were imagined as, this barbaric, irrational species, right? What else? Exactly, because of all these types of people and their habits is the cause. Um, yeah, so another video, for instance, of this girl who's Asian on TikTok. So she's demonstrating how to avoid um, contracting coronavirus. So, for instance, she's, saying, she's showing, that you shouldn't touch the buttons in the elevator and things like that. You should, use an object to touch it, etc., etc. And then people would say that she probably already has coronavirus, so it's not useful for her to be making this video. And another person says, yeah, but no way you can avoid the AIDS though, so again, Asians are imagined as this disease carrying immigrants, right? And then in this other TikTok video, this boy is making some ramen. So he's, showing how to make delicious ramen with different foods, saying when your parents are not home cooking for you, then this is what you can do to have a delicious meal. And then some people would say that, where's your bats, right? You forgot your bats, right? So again, it's this, connotation that Asian people eat bats, so they brought coronavirus to the West, right? Which is, completely arguable. And even if, bat has something to do with coronavirus, it is still xenophobic to imagine, right, all these young Asian people as one entity to start with. And even if they were Chinese, it still doesn't say anything about these specific people and their relationship with coronavirus, right? So this is exactly not just stereotyping, but I would say intensified xenophobia. Okay, so like this girl, so she's not really doing anything. I think it's just, a video showing someone being pretty. So then, she's said as, so other people are saying, oh, you're pretty, whatever, right? But then, some users would say that I don't see anything except coronavirus in it, right? So, yeah. So sushi at the time was considered this barbaric import, right? Because it uses raw fish to serve. And it is a culture that was then feared but admired at the same time. So Americans were fascinated but also scared. So by the late 90s to there were already, 400% increase of sushi bars nationwide. By the 2010s, there were 20,000 Japanese restaurants nationwide. So that means that although, there's this, anxiety about eating raw fish, Americans continued to consume sushi and realized that, with some special preparation technique and proper way to, store food, then it's actually just, a foreign food culture that they're not familiar with, but it's safe. So the prices of sushi also dropped. So when it first came to America, it was very inaccessible, just like what we see in Breakfast Club, right? Only upper class teenage girl could afford it. But then by the late 2000s, we were able to find 6 pieces of sushi from the supermarket for $5. So that means, it is the, in retrospect that we see in the mid 80s that this anxiety about raw fish um, collides with this Japan panic that we talked about, right? So we talked about the Japan panic in relation to the auto manufacturing industry. So this Japan panic, right, of fearing Japanese colonization of the United States, fearing their excellent sales, fearing of their cultural soft power. So all these, become sort of a scare for Americans. So, for instance, in the 90s Hollywood movies, such as Rising Sun, we would see Japanese characters killing, hurting, um, patronizing white women. So, these Japanese characters are all villains, and they are portrayed as rich businessmen, sick Asian men, and they kill white women. Um, in Showdown in Little Tokyo, they are portrayed as rich businessmen using white women's bodies to serve sushi. So sushi always has this extremely exotic um, connotation in its early introduction to America. So, however, McCavett reminds us that there's always this actually power dynamic about eating sushi, because when you eat sushi, you're actually eating fish caught on one side of the planet, transported to another side of the planet. So there's always this, idea of exhausting, idea of exploration that we talked about in colonial fantasy as well, right? So, for instance, a food historian, Farah, so he would suggest that actually the behavior of consuming sushi can be imagined as sort of a culinary contact zones. So typically, historically and classically, we would imagine, for instance, that contact zones are space between different nations, different countries, and usually these spaces are geographical, they're physical spaces. But then during the age of globalization, then sociologists, scholars would suggest that actually, the spaces are no longer always geographical, right? It can be, the food, it can be the consumption. So, it is through eating sushi that we are able to actually participate in this kind of like spaces of cultural friction and creativity. What I mean is that, in these spaces, when two different cultures collide, then there are always, these hybrid forms of products, hybrid forms of cultural clashes. So sushi in this case becomes a good example to demonstrate this kind of hybridity. So, for instance, um, Americans at the time thought that sushi was essentially authentically Japanese. They thought by eating sushi, they could experience some type of essential Japaneseness. But actually, sushi was localized. For instance, California roll is localized, Texas roll is localized, Philadelphia roll is localized. So if you look at the contents of California roll, then we see avocado, right? Avocado is a very Californian thing, right? It is sort of an inexpensive substitute of some Japanese ingredients that chefs here found, and it's tasty, it's delicious. And then Texas roll is made of lettuce or spinach and beef. Okay, so that's also not historically what you use to make sushi. And then Philadelphia roll is not about Philadelphia. Philadelphia roll is actually rolls made of cream cheese, and because we have Philadelphia cream cheese, right? So they call it Philadelphia roll, and salmon. So that means all these localized sushi versions, right, are actually examples of middle grounds of what Farah is suggesting, right? They're actually examples of cultural convergence, right? So, for instance, in American history, we have had other examples like these. The Polish Jewish immigrants brought bagels to America in the 17th century, and then bagel became sort of the quintessential New York brunch, right? If you thought you wanted a typical New York fast breakfast or brunch, is possible that you would think of bagels and cream cheese and logs. Um, and it is the Scandinavian Jewish immigrants who thankfully brought all these, delicious food items to America. However, this type of, recognition of being American never happened to sushi. So today, right, nobody would actually, suspect that, bagels with cream cheese and logs is not American, but no one would think that sushi is American, right? So it's very interesting. So that means that, there's always this kind of like forever foreignness in some products and possibly people. So we know that, in the 80s, for instance, we talked about, the national American media was very much fascinated with everything Japanese. They had a show called Shogun on NBC, and it's about some imperial ancient Japanese characters and American characters visiting there. So at the same time, we also saw other auxiliary food products along with sushi, such as cookbooks. And that's the time when Americans would want to learn how to make sushi at home. So um, they would also, show Americans how to make other more sort of approachable types of Japanese foods, such as teriyaki and tempura and sukiyaki. So these books would, show, how you can make grilled, broiled, fried beef or chicken or common seafoods at home. And then these books would be printed very nicely, and they would also function as coffee table books for the yuppies, right? And then sushi making would also be incorporated as one of these, imaginations of essential Japaneseness, beside geisha and cherry blossom interior design. So, it's all these, cliche stereotypes of Japaneseness that in the 80s we saw in the public sphere. By the late 70s, there's already this, successful boomer generation. So although there's uncertainty, but the boomers at the time already achieved their economic success. So they were the ruling class, and they were also the generation that was somehow open to international travel, the generation that was able to afford the travel. So there's this, ideal of growing cosmopolitanism among the boomer generation. They were educated. They were ideologically more curious and open than um, the conservative generation. So they would also see eating sushi as sort of a sign of an education, ideological statuses, and cultural capital. And sometimes they're mocked for, eating sushi as being pretentious. So we also witnessed that, that after the passing of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that other Southeastern Asian, Latin American, and African immigrants opened their own eateries in America. And they would be imagined as low status people, and the sushi eateries would be imagined as upper class, joints. So there's also this clear class distinction, right, among different immigrant joints. And we also at the time, in the 70s, realized that, sushi could actually function as a good alternative for the fat and cholesterol worried diets in America. So since the 70s, the private and government funded studies came out and they encourage Americans to eat low fat and low cholesterol diets, and sushi somehow fits this demand. So there's this generation of calorie conscious, status conscious consumers would then, consume sushi, although with the high sodium soy sauce available at the time, it's actually still not exactly the healthiest thing to eat. But the sodium concern came a little later in American history. So that means, there are two types of globalization participation that we're talking about. One type is the global authentic type. So, the global authentics would actually demand what they thought the most authentic cultural experience when they consume sushi. So they would always think that, you should have geisha, you should have blossom inferior when you eat sushi, because that's the exact, pre-modern Japanese experience. While the global hybrids would enjoy the remix, the mashup, the sort of like localized versions of Japanese products, such as California rolls and Texas rolls. So that means that in this case, Japaneseness is often imagined as cliches, stereotypes, tropes, such as you would see Japanese restaurants using these tropes to highlight a type of aesthetic beauty, delicacy, sensuality, eroticism, effeminacy. But it's not necessarily that they're trying to self-orientalize. It's more about the American consumers' expectation. Like if they walk into a Japanese restaurant and it looks like just like your regular mid-century American restaurants, then they're not going to think that you make good food. But if you just display all these stereotypes, then they thought that they're in an authentic place. So it is the same time that we also saw food critics. They would become the authoritative cultural intermediary figures. They would, coach Americans how to behave in sushi restaurants, where to sit in sushi bars. Like they would, for instance, advise Americans that if you sit at a table, then you are not the insider. You don't really know, but if you sit at the bar, then you're in the know, right? And then they would advise them to learn how to use chopsticks, to drink without spoon, because if you use a spoon to drink your soup, then it's not the traditional way and all that. So there are all kinds of just uh, authenticity seeking food criticism in the national media. And they would also enjoy seeing waitresses in kimonos walking tiny steps to serve customers. They would talk about the soji screen paneling, the partitions with cherry tree poles, huge rice paper globe lights, the lanterns and framed calligraphy, oversized painted fans, and recorded Japanese folk music, Japanese clientele. So it's not just the interior. Actually, even the people, right? They're functioned as sort of, as signs of authenticity. So, for instance, Glacian, a food historian, would say that it is in this historical context we can see that authenticity is always an artificial construct. It is an assumption of a homogeneous and unchanging cultural other, right? So this goes hand in hand with Said's criticism about Orientalism, right? That the Orient is always imagined as this pre-modern, unchanging, static space, exotic, producing barbaric foods, but also beautiful things, right? So there's this mysterious place. So all these, are artificial. All these are actually, just prejudices added to, you know, the Orient. So Henke, another food historian, would say that we should therefore think that these foodies. So you would have American foodies, venturing different big cities to tell you where the most authentic Japanese restaurants is in LA, in New York, whatever. So Henke would say that actually these foodies are assuming the authentic from the inauthentic, expects the unexpected. So as a result, the restaurants and chefs would self-orientalize, like what I said, right? Because they know that if they put out all these stereotypes, then they're going to make money, right? So in a way, there's this demanded, predictable exoticism of performing the unexpected. And the unexpected, ironically, is exactly the expected, right? So what's McCavitt's proposition? So he thinks that we should actually think this way. We should be self-conscious. We should be creative. We should celebrate the cultural hybridity. For instance, today we have, in Moscow, jellied meat sushi. So, jellied meat is sort of a characteristic of Eastern European food. So jellied meat sushi, right, is sort of a combination of Japanese and Eastern European food cultures, and pickled mushroom sushi, right? And miso cappuccino, right? That's also very European, right? And then, for instance, in Brazil, we see sushi with tropical foods, right? Like this one. These are Brazilian sushi made of, tropical foods. And then in the US, we also have sushi burrito. So it's actually, wrapped like a burrito, but then you see, raw fish in here. It's very hearty, delicious. So what did the Japanese government, or the kind of classicists do in response to this kind of like cultural hybridity? They were not happy about this. For instance, there's this Japanese food protectionism. They thought that sushi restaurants shouldn't be opened, owned, or run by Korean, Chinese, and Filipino peoples, because they are not authentic Japanese people. And they are also not happy with sushi made of cream cheese and smoked salmon. And they're also not happy with Westerners dressed in samurai costume. They thought that that everyone should use authentic ingredients, and chefs should receive traditional training, and everyone should retain the aesthetics. So that's the kind of like not global authentic, but sort of protectionist authentic approach. But there are also, famous chefs who embrace hybridity, such as Nobuyaki Meiju. So we see, Japanese chefs like him who travel to Latin America and in the 70s and 80s, and sort of like combine the food cultures. So you would see Nobu's menu as cultural hybrid. That you would see fusion dishes. So that's one thing to think about as well. So this concludes today's idea. So let's look at the last example I want to show you. So this is makizushi. So makizushi originally is wrapped like this. So the seaweed is outside. And then in the 70s, then the chefs realized that Americans really don't like the idea of using paper to wrap around their food. And they thought the seaweed is like a piece of paper. So they didn't like it. They felt that, they're like eating paper. So then the chefs actually invented this type. They sort of like roll the paper in so that Americans would be able to, eat it without actually, feeling the coarseness and the rigidity of the seafood or the seaweed. The seaweed is hidden right in here, so you could still get the flavor, but then the seaweed is already moist, right? So, it doesn't feel like that someone's eating paper. I mean, for Americans. Yeah, so I hope you enjoy Kathy's chapter. I thought it's very interesting. So I will see you in our next video about anime.